Imagine following a tiny checkered scorpion along a dusty cliffside, and when you look up, discovering that the sun has already set on a day you don't remember. That's how one of our stories begins, with a trivial curiosity and a gap in time so wide it feels like the world blinked without you. Tonight I'm sharing 7 camping encounters pulled from people who were there. Not ghost hunters, not thrill seekers, just folks who went into the woods and came back with questions. No gore, no wild claims of proof, just what they saw, what they felt, and how the ordinary turned quietly, insistently wrong. If these kinds of compilations are your thing, there's extra material over on the patrons' feed. Nothing flashy, just longer versions of these testimonies for anyone who wants to sit with the details. For now, keep your flashlight close and your footsteps lighter. We begin at Guadalupe State Park. They were teenagers, siblings I'd guess by the way they moved together, curious, uneasy, laughing too loudly at nothing. Early afternoon, they decided to walk along a fossil-lined bluff, poking at rock crevices for the kind of shells that look like the ocean when you hold them in sunlight. The boys spotted it first, a small scorpion with an odd pattern, not the matte brown you expect in that region, but black and white like someone had painted tiny squares along its back. He called to his sister. They followed, careful to keep the creature in view, tracing it between sun-baked stones and the thin scrub that clung to the cliff edge. It was a silly thing to do on paper, chase an insect for the novelty, but the description that matters is the mood. The air changed, they say. The breeze, which had been warm and dry, turned soft and cold, as if a door had closed on the day. The sky didn't go overcast, it didn't rain, it simply lost its light. One moment the fields were sunlit, the next the world had the flat blue of twilight, and their shadows elongated in the wrong direction. The scorpion disappeared under a rock. The teens felt a queasy unsteadiness, not fear exactly, but a pressure at the base of the skull, the kind of dread that makes you hurry for no clear reason. They walked back toward the trailhead. There were cars where they expected none. Headlights, voices, rangers, 7 of them, official and green, hunting in pairs with flashlights, radios clipped to their chests. The rangers asked the same thing. Where had they been? The teens tried to give a location, gesture at the bluff, point to the fossils, but the words came out wrong, too fast, like a dream retold. One ranger looked at the boy's phone, then had a chronometer clipped to a ranger's belt. The boy's phone showed nearly 4 hours missing. The bushes they'd crisscrossed had no print marks beyond their own. No other hikers in the area had seen them. No overturned rocks, no obvious disturbance except the scorpion's hiding place.
Later, alone and sitting on their car tailgate, they compared timestamps. Photos from earlier that afternoon and later that evening had the same battery percentage, the same background processes, but an 8-hour gap between them. The sun on the earlier images was bright and flat. The later ones had the deep blue twilight the rangers had been searching under. They walked the trail again that night with a park ranger. He shrugged in the way professionals often do when the map doesn't match the walk. "Out here, odd things happen," he said, and left it at that. No rational explanation followed. They were shaken, precise with the details, embarrassed by the gap, and furious at their own fecklessness. Missing time is a small phrase that opens a wide and terrible hole. They could not explain how hours evaporated between a verse sunlight and a ranger's flashlight. There was no gore, no possession metaphors, no dramatic confrontation, just a loss. A tiny scorpion, a deepening dusk out of season. 7 rangers asking one simple question: where were you? That's where the first story ends for most practical purposes, with a blank span they cannot fill. But the blank leaves things behind: a scent of oil in the hair, a residue of static on the skin, the sense, most of all, that something in the landscape doesn't obey human time. Sometimes the woods take pieces of a day, sometimes they stare back. The next account comes from a place designed to teach young people about stories much older than marshmallow roasts, a Christian summer camp. The witness was a new counselor, 22, early in the season, still learning names and schedules and which bunks were quiet. She'd volunteered for the late shift, the kind of job where you check lights, make sure everyone's teeth are brushed, and walk the dark paths between cabins. That night, the camp's dormitory smelled of lemon cleaner and wet socks. The bunk they'd assigned into was empty when she checked, rumpled sheets, a blanket folded at the end. She made a joke into the darkness as she crawled into bed, half expecting a friend to shush her. None of the cots had a person in them. She fell asleep shortly after her last radio check. Her dream began as confusion. She dreamed of a long hallway punctuated by stained glass windows, the kind of corridor you see in movies about monasteries. The air in the dream tasted metallic. Someone pulled at her ankle, dragging her. There was a heat like a small fireplace at the end of the corridor, bath-shot orange that made everything shimmer. I could feel hands on my feet, squeezing, as if plucking me from the bed and pulling me toward the light.
I woke, gasping, heart thudding, an ache along my lower legs. In the dimness of the dorm, I reached down, and there were marks, pale at first, then blossoming into the raw color of bruises, shaped oddly, not like a fall, but like fingers pressed and dragged. They were along her calves and the soles of my feet.
When she turned to the bunk that had been empty, there was an impression in the mattress, like someone had been sitting there very recently. A depression, an indentation in the pillow. But the bunk was unoccupied. She reported it to another counselor in the morning, simple, frustrated. I woke up with these. The counselor searched the roster, pulled video logs from cabin cameras. None of the cameras caught anyone entering her bunk that night. There were noisy kids on the opposite wing. There were the steady creaks of an old building settling. The physical marks did not have an origin in any captured footage. No one admitted to being in her bed. The kid who had been supposed to take the night shift claimed he'd been at the mess hall, knees deep in dishes. An upper staffer gently suggested she'd been sleepwalking. She wanted to believe that, because sleepwalking is a neat, physiological explanation that leaves no room for dread. But she knew the difference between restlessness and a heavy, dragging pressure around the throat, the sensation in the dream that her limbs were not entirely her own. The bruises were shaped like hands. She showed them to the cap director. He listened, face neutral. He said he would note it in the log and advised rest. She left the camp 2 weeks later, not because of the bruises alone, but because the thing stuck to her like a shadow. Her sleeping patterns shifted. Sometimes she would be a dozen miles away during the day and feel that same pressure in the hospital of her chest, a tiny tug at the muscles, as if something behind her were making an effort to reach in. She still dreams of the hallway. Once, she told me, she woke up and heard a voice say her name from the empty bunk, a child's whisper, imitative and wrong. No one was there. That detail, more than the bruises, is the thing she carries. It suggests an intelligence that knows how to mimic and how to get close enough under cover of human routine to leave marks you can't explain. A pattern begins to emerge in these stories: proximity without confirmation, presence left where presence shouldn't be. In songbirds, in electricity, in the quiet of a room at night, there is an attention paid to humans, and sometimes it replies. If you're still with me, now would be a good time to check your lights. And if you enjoy hearing longer versions, join those patrons I mentioned. Another short audio of these testimonies sits behind that paywall, raw and longer. But stay for the next story. It's one where the sky seems to be listening. Coro Beach is supposed to be straightforward. Dunes, a long arc of sand, gulls that circle until you leave them bored. The pair who reported what happened there were not camp kids or ghost-obsessed teenagers. They were a couple whose work deals in data and materials, engineers or scientists, no nonsense and meticulous. They went camping on the beach intending to sleep beneath the stars and wake to tide patterns and the smell of salt.
They set up their small tent near a line of dune grass and spent the evening talking about simple things: the next day's plans, the best route for tide pools. Around midnight, the couple sat by the car with thermoses and a Bluetooth speaker playing something low and instrumental. The first sign they noticed was not a sound, but a light. A bright, forked flash like lightning, but not sky-to-ground lightning, more like a paintbrush across the atmosphere, smooth and thin. It didn't create noise. Then another, a thread of color weaving through the trees behind the dunes, too precise to be a meteor or a plane. The couple rose, rational and curious, and walked toward the dunes to see what could make such illumination. What they found was not an aircraft, but something that moved like a live filament, long, thin, colored threads that drifted between trunks and branches with a fluid, almost aquatic motion. The lights had edges that softened into the night and then sharpened to nodes that pulsed gently. When the couple flashed their car headlights toward the dunes, a beam from the lights reacted. It shot a sister pulse toward their light and held, a narrow shaft that matched the angle of their beam exactly. They blinked. The light remained fixed on their car, then shifted as they angled their lights left and right. It responded immediately, tracking and mirroring. When they dimmed, the beam eased. When they flashed their headlights in quick staccato, the pulse twitched in small, short flickers, as if testing. That's the precise part. These were not random atmospheric refractions. The lights behaved like an observer learning to mimic human signaling. Then a sound arrived, laughter, small and distant, from a place that held no one. It was not the rough laugh of a group. It was high and brittle and unnerving,
like someone playing with a toy. They walked toward the sound, leaving the car and the safety of the lights behind. The threads wove around them, not touching, always a measured distance away. Occasionally, one passed so close you could see the bead of condensation along its edge. The laughter continued, but never localized. Later, they found a single rubbish bag, not full, but oddly arranged on the sand near where they'd stood. It was tied and folded in a way that did not look like random human laziness. The bag contained nothing of consequence. The couple photographed everything with timestamps rooted in the methodical habit of their work. They left before dawn, their data notched with bafflement and a cold certainty that something in those dunes was capable of attention and unnervingly polite mimicry. We tell ourselves the ocean is wide enough that all oddities can be explained away by currents and human noise. But when lights answer your headlights and laughter has no source, the margin for ordinary explanation narrows.
From the uncanny to the overtly unnerving, the next story takes place inland along a creek where people go to pan for gold and escape for the weekend. It begins with a warning, which is how many dangerous things start. A neighbor or stranger who cares enough to say, "Be careful." This couple had been driving out of town for a couple of weekends, packing a small cooker, a pan, patience. They met a local man near the stream who, in passing, mentioned with a shrug that people sometimes vanish around there. He didn't dramatize it, he said it quietly, like a weather report. The area draws some folks, and some folks don't come back or don't come back the same. He mentioned a truck, a dark gray truck that hangs about the dirt turnoff, a vehicle that doesn't seem to belong to anyone particular, but keeps showing up where you don't want it. At first, they took that as backcountry lore, but then the truck appeared. It was a dark gray pickup that seemed always parked at an angle, as if watching the road more than using it. They passed it once, waved, and a man in the cab smiled in a way that was more intent than friendly. He didn't wave back. When they moved to a deeper bend in the creek to pan, the truck was suddenly there again, close enough that the couple could see the driver's profile through the rearview mirror, a shadowed face with a jaw that clenched. He offered advice about the best spots as an opener, then lingered while they worked. On the second day, the couple tried to give him a wide berth. The truck slowed and then pulled in front of them at a narrow part of the road, blocking their exit. The driver leaned out and asked innocuous questions. "Are you here alone? Do you have family? Where are you headed?" When the man asked, "Are you looking for something?" there was a tightness in his voice that didn't match the simple light of the sentence. It made the couple nervous in a way that wasn't purely personal. It made them feel small and visible, the way prey might feel when a curious animal corners them in tall grass. They left that evening with their equipment packed, and the truck a dot behind them on the ridge. They reported the menacing presence to a local ranger, who noted the truck's description and promised to keep an eye out. The couple's takeaway wasn't a supernatural episode so much as a human one. The wilderness is filled with other people who carry intentions. Their fear was practical, the kind that changes the route you take and the time you decide to return. Human predation is a kind of horror that requires no spectral explanation. It requires simple caution. But the story takes on a different weight when paired with other accounts of being followed, of belongings left out as if staged, and of voices that mimic familiar tones. The human threat in the creek foreshadows a different kind of closeness, one that can put hands on tents, that can knock on a vehicle window after midnight.
Keep that in mind as we move toward places where the line between mimicry and approach blurs. There's a difference between being watched and being called. You can bear the gaze, you cannot bear the sound that imitates your friends in the dark. We arrive now at Levite Lake. I say Levite because witnesses spelled it in several ways. If you encounter the place on older maps and it appears differently, mark it as indefinido. The precise historic name is unclear in reporting. What matters is the setting, a remote lakeshore popular with overlanders and rooftop tent campers. The account is told by a single camper who spent 3 nights there and whose experience escalated across the stay, building a cumulative dread that refused to be explained away. The camper set up his rooftop tent on the back of a pickup, the kind that gives you a bed above the ground and a sense of being closer to the stars. The first night nothing of note occurred besides the usual sounds of owls and the distant slap of water. The second night, around 2 in the morning, he heard footsteps on the roof. Not the soft settling of the tent fabric, but heavy, paced steps that traveled from the edge of the roof toward the center, stopping in measured intervals as if someone were testing the material. He unzipped the tent and peered into the dark. Moonlight made the truck's tailgate a silver plane. No one was visible. He chalked it up to a raccoon or an overly confident fox. The third night is where the account tightens. He fell asleep and later woke to the sound of his name called from outside the tent. It was a voice he knew, his brother's Cadence, a private nickname. The voice called his name twice, patient and kind. He sat up, heart snapping to attention, but unzipped the flap slowly and looked out into the campsite. Empty. The only other truck had moved off earlier in the evening.
He crawled out and listened. No rustle of footsteps, no flashlight beam. The impression remained that someone had stood on the roof and had leaned into the canvas and called. When he climbed down the ladder to inspect the tent exterior, he found an indentation across the top of the fabric, a clear ridge where weight had pressed the canvas down, and along the seam there was a fresh tear as if something had tried to force its way through. The tear was small, near the zipper pull, as if a hand had pushed from the outside and been stopped by the tension of the fabric. He felt the hair on his arms rise in the way you get when a sound is wrong in familiar rooms. The thought that someone could have been inches away calling in his brother's voice felt worse than any animal on the roof. It felt like a mimicry with purpose. He told his friend about it the next morning, not as bravado but as raw curiosity. The friend had seen nothing on the roof the previous nights, though they camped in a tight cluster of vehicles and shared a thermos. The tear was there, the indentation visible when the sun caught it.
No footprints in the thin dust spoke to a ladder having been used. They attached lights to the truck and sat awake for the rest of the night, fingers on keys and radios, but nothing returned except the normal nocturnal chorus. The following morning, the roof fabric had a faint smear like the outline of fingertips pressed through canvas. Not blood, not dirt, just a slightly darker discoloration no one could explain. Here the story does not end with an arrest, or a standoff, or a clear sighting. It ends instead with the loss of security. That it was the brother's voice, or something that sounded like it, is the detail that haunts the retelling. If a sound can be borrowed and used to lure, the nighttime is less about the wild and more about the uncanny imitation of the known. He left a week later with a sliver of the canvas missing and a sense that the campsite had been invited to watch him sleep. We could stop for a breath, but there are more accounts that tighten this pattern. Lights that respond, voices that imitate, physical evidence with no creator. Each story is its own window into the same unsettling possibility, that being alone in the woods does not guarantee solitude in any meaningful sense. I'll tell you this much and then we'll step forward. On the trail out from Levitt Lake, some hikers reported hearing a chorus of footsteps that matched the cadence of their own. One hiker said the sound stopped when he stopped and then started again when he moved. He turned and flashed his headlamp and caught 3 small lights hovering among the pines, moving in a deliberate, coordinated way. He felt watched. He moved off the path faster. That detail stitches the Levitt roof incident to something smaller and more precise, which is where the next story begins. The trail is narrow, the air cooler under pines, and the dog, a collie with a stern disposition, refused to move forward without dragging his owner like a man in a dream waking to a threat. If you have a dog, you know the little moments when they look at something you cannot see and refuse to budge. They are often early alarm systems. On a late afternoon walk, a woman from a nearby town saw 3 small glowing orbs dancing down a creek path. They were about the size of apples, luminous and synchronized. They held formation and matched her pace when she sped up, then slowed in perfect counterpoint. Her dog trembled. When she stopped to call the animal, the orbs hovered over the path and shifted closer in a slow, curious circle before withdrawing into the trees. She tried to follow on a whim and found only indentations in the leaf litter, not deep prints, but a smoothness in the ground like something skipped along the surface. The orbs did not emit sound. They did, however, seem to react to gestures. When she raised her hand, they pulsed. When she hissed at the dog to be quiet, one of the orbs turned toward her as if listening.
She left that day with the dog clinging to her leg and a shaken feeling that something small and aware had chosen to examine her. You will notice an escalating closeness as we move through these accounts, from missing time to bruises to lights that answer, trucks that stalk, steps on a rooftop, and now orbs that shadow and respond. There is a rhythm to the night in these stories, an intelligence or pattern that learns to observe. But this is where we pause for now, not because the stories have run out, but because the next account folds many of these threads together in a way that changes the tone. It begins on a lake's shore where someone found objects left with a care that felt staged, where phantom sounds rose like a low engine hum when nothing should make noise. These are accounts that suggest someone, or something, gathers the items that remind us of people. They tidy keys, pack a camera in a Ziploc as if to preserve memory, lay a cigarette pack as a calling card, and then they vanish again, leaving only the hush of a lake and a faint but steady hum that refuses to belong to the landscape. The witnesses left us photographs and shaky recordings that capture little more than waves and a distant, low-frequency buzzing. The images show plastic bags on the sand, tied neatly, no prints around them,
no footprints approaching or receding. The objects inside, a camera, a lighter, a set of keys, belonged to no one the local anglers recognized. When asked, they shrugged. There are always people who leave things. But when the humming returns at night, it draws a line through the ordinary, a thread of sound that sounds like an engine, but lacks an engine's movement or source. One man described it as the sound of a radio wound down to a frequency that makes your bones ache. It hovered at the exact bandwidth where sound becomes sensation. The more time we sit with that report, the more it echoes the earlier days, objects staged, sounds organized, and attention paid to the belongings and lives of campers. I could keep going with the remaining accounts, the orbs that followed, the carefully placed personal effects on the shore of Elk Lake, the echoing laughter, and the absence of a person to tie it to. But there's a point here where the tension should tighten. The stories we've told so far form a chain. Missing hours, marks on a body, lights that answer human light, predatory human watchers, footsteps and the voice of someone you know, small lights that mimic pace, and items left like breadcrumbs with no clear taster. They are different faces of the same uneasy phenomenon. The woods are not merely passive. Sometimes they answer. I'll stop here for a moment. We've walked a long arc tonight already, from a scorpion on a bluff to a tear in canvas and the sting of a bruise shaped like fingers. These are real people telling real things they don't have an explanation for.
The next accounts will go further. Orbs that approach with intention, and the Elk Lake testimony that ties the staged items to hums that resonate through the night and into a person's sleep. There's more to uncover about how these items are arranged, why the humming happens in places far from power lines, and what it feels like to be called by the voice of someone who isn't there. We'll return to that, but first, take a breath with me. Outside, a wind might be moving through trees you can't see. It has its own logic, and sometimes it carries echoes of things we can't assign names to. When you step back into the dark tonight, consider this. The wilderness has always been a mirror. It returns what we bring, and sometimes echoes in ways we don't anticipate. The stories you heard so far end with people alive, shaken and changed. They are still asking why. They are still watching their clocks and checking their seams. There are two more accounts, the floating orb encounter in closer detail, and Elk Lake's eerie staging and hum, and they get at the heart of what these reports share: attention, mimicry, and traces left behind. We'll pick those up next and sit with what it feels like when the night borrows a voice and leaves your belongings on the sand. For now, keep this image with you. A tiny scorpion that leads the world into dusk, and 7 rangers asking where you were when the sun slipped away. They called it a walk that should have been ordinary. She left the house to give the dog a run and to clear her head. Just a quick trail loop out behind town, the kind of path you take when you want river noise and nothing else. The afternoon was slipping into that thin right where trees throw long fingers across the path and a chill pools under the pines. She brought a flashlight because she always does, and she carried her phone in a hand that would later be trembling. The dog was a collie, bright-eyed and tuned to the world in a way humans aren't. He pulled ahead, then slowed, then planted his feet and refused to move as if anchored by something only he could sense. She called, and he looked back with a face that said clearly, "Don't go there." She laughed then, the nervous laugh people use to cover the small cold that collects under their ribs, and took another step. That's when she saw them. 3 lights, the size of apples, hovering at about head height between the trunks. They didn't hang like lanterns. They moved with the smoothness of something buoyant and alive. They were not fixed to branches or wires. The lights held formation. As she shifted pace, they matched it, closing and matching her stride without touching. When she sped up, they quickened. When she slowed, they hovered and slowed as if timing themselves to the cadence of her feet. The first reaction is practical disbelief. She thought of toys, of fishing glow sticks caught in branches, of pranstons with LED rigs. None of those explanations fit what she saw.
The lights kept a margin of distance, politely curious, and they reacted to small gestures. She raised her hand, half joking to herself, and the nearest orb pulsed its brightness like an answer. It was not blinding, it was deliberate, as if signaling, "I see you." Her phone rendered the event as silence in pixels. She filmed, fingers shaking, and for a few seconds the orbs are there, tight orbs of color that shimmer and then blur into the trees. The video shows their movement as a soft smear, their pulsing as tiny crescendos of white. In one clip you can hear the dog whine low in the background, and then a sharp yelp as it flinches away from something the camera can't cleanly record. On playback, the audio registers a high, thin frequency under the wind, more a felt sensation than a tone, a sound that makes the back of the teeth hum. She named that frequency later when she tried to describe what the dog felt, wrongness in the throat. She didn't try to engage, she did not throw stones or shout. She stepped back, and the orbs backed off, holding their formation like three cautious surveyors. When she turned and walked home, they followed at a distance for as long as the tree line framed her silhouette. When she reached the small bridge over the creek, the light stopped at its edge, and then, without anything cinematic or dramatic, drifted away together into the dark. They didn't race off. They folded into the underbrush and were gone in 3 long, measured beats. After that, the dog refused that trail. It would stop at the driveway and plant its feet until she coaxed it on a different route. A friend who later walked the same path with a group reported feeling watched. They saw nothing, but their breath felt shallow and their steps sounded wrong. That friend pressed the dirt where the orbs had hovered and found the leaf litter smoothed in small, shallow channels, as if something small had skimmed the ground. Not footprints exactly, more like the path of an insect, but too precise to be mere wind. She returned once with a friend and a lantern and more courage than sense. They waited at dusk. The light was almost cinematic, a cool blue pouring through the pines. Hours passed with nothing. At about the time her phone died, 3 pale pulses slid into view, moved across the trail as if pausing for inspection, and then when the pair tried to follow, slipped sideways between trunks and vanished as if through a seam in the forest. No rustle, no rusted wire snapping, just an absence that read like a trick in the film of the night. Rangers in the county have heard variations on this. They take reports, scribble them into logs, and sometimes warn hikers about pranks. But the thing about these reports is the pattern of behavior. The lights don't merely hang, they observe, they mirror, they retreat. Animals notice them first. Dogs snarl. Birds lift off in flocks.
People who have spent a life outdoors, hunters, long-distance hikers, use the same words to describe the same oddness: precise, curious, not random. They are small, yes, but small things can be intimate. They can close on you. They can follow the speed of your heartbeat. The woman who first filmed them stopped going out alone. She altered her routes. She left a trail camera on the tree line for a week and retrieved footage showing nothing but wind-moved leaves, until, on the 5th night, 3 tiny glints passed through the frames so fast and so clean that the camera's exposure smeared them into a triple comet. Software could not render them clearly. The pixels refused to hold. She sent the clips to a local online forum where campers trade warnings and pictures. The thread filled up with accounts of similar lights: a boy on a bike who swore they mirrored his wheel, an elderly man who saw them above his cornfield and felt his skin prickle, a couple who drove along a remote road and watched 3 orbs hover like streetlights where no wires existed. Each story had a small difference. The pattern held. What to do with such small, precise encounters? For some, the orbs are an invitation to curiosity. For the woman who saw them, the orbs were a boundary she did not want to press. Intelligence, however quiet or alien, that practices attention on humans feels like a crossing of a line. You expect beasts to notice you. You do not expect something to match your steps and answer your hand. When the natural world learns the rhythms of human movement, it narrows the margin for privacy. The orbs are least dramatic when compared to a beach of painted threads or a truck that blocks your exit. They are smaller, calmer, but their closeness can be the most alarming, the sense that something small and without a face is studying the way you walk through the world. If the orbs asked questions, Elk Lake leaves answers in objects. People began bringing photographs to the marina and to the bait shop. Morning shots of an otherwise empty stretch of shore with 3 small Ziploc bags sitting like offerings near the high water line. The bags were carefully tied, not thrown. Inside, a camera in one, a pack of cigarettes in another, a ring of car keys in the third. The items were not random trash. They were personal things, the sort of objects you might put in a pocket before bed. The fishermen who passed those photographs around said one thing in common. None of those items belonged to anyone who fished that day. They were not recognized. The items were clean. The bags had not been dragged through the pebbles. They looked placed rather than abandoned. The first witness I spoke with saw the bags on a gray morning when the lake looked like steel and the gulls were thin scratches against the sky. He was an early riser, the sort who goes down to the shore for coffee and to see if the wind will bring in fish.
He found the bags lined up as if someone had been arranging a display, spaced with a regularity of ritual rather than chance. There were no local footprints leading to them, no prints leading away. The sand around them was smoothed as if wiped clean. On the recorder, his voice tightens when he mentions the hum. It started as a low, steady vibration in the ribs of the world, a sound like an engine idling far away, but with no moving carrier. There were nights when the lake hummed so that people woke from sleep with the sound lodged behind their teeth. One man described sitting in his camper chair, watching the horizon, and feeling the hum as pressure rather than as a melody. It rose and fell in slow waves. Engineers who later examined amateur audio clips said the frequency sat at the border of human hearing, more felt than heard, and that it could create a sense of nausea or disorientation after prolonged exposure. The theory didn't make anyone feel better. One couple who found their old canoe keys neatly placed in a bag took a picture and posted it to a neighborhood group with a wry caption that read, "Are we leaving anything behind for the lake?" and got replies ranging from jokes to fearful messages. An older woman commented that she had found a short set of wooden steps leading into shallow water one morning, a little staircase that rose from the pebbles and ended abruptly in the lake as though a house had once stood there and someone had taken only the upper rooms. The steps were weathered but not old enough to have rotted entirely away. No property records listed such a landing near that particular cove. The woman climbed down onto the steps and felt them flex under her weight, the wood green with moss. She swore she felt a pull, like a current that wanted her to move toward the lake without using the limbs she had trained to walk. That detail, of stairs that lead nowhere, is one of those images that lodge in people's minds. It suggests intention in setting, someone or something assembled an approach to the wire. It implies that the shoreline was being prepared for arrivals or departures that didn't align with the ordinary comings and goings of anglers. Rangers visited the spots. They took photographs, logged the bags as recovered items, and tried to match serial numbers and owners. Some items were traced back to local lost and found lists, an old camera belonging to a family that had misplaced it weeks earlier, a lighter that matched a brand found in a typical campsite. But many of the objects were unclaimed. They remained orphaned, sitting in the marina's evidence locker until owners came forward, which rarely happened. The place where the items were found was not a well-trodden path. It sat a small walk from the nearest access road, the kind of place you only reach on purpose. The humming persisted. People recorded it at night, low, almost tectonic waves that rolled through the camper's vinyl and made the cups on tables vibrate.
One man recorded him speaking into his phone and then stopped the audio when the hum climbed and his voice trembled. When played back, the clip captured something else under the hum, a thin harmonic ring that rose and fell at a regular interval, like a metronome, but set to a note found in the hollow of your chest. Scientists who heard it said it could be geological, a resonance from the lakebed, or it could be something in the woodwork of old piers. But the sound was recorded in sections of shoreline far from any structure. It registered as a physical fact to anyone who lived through it. The people who encountered the staged objects and the hum reacted in different ways. Some treated it as urban legend material and told the story with a laugh. Others took it as a prompt to stop leaving things on benches and to keep their cars locked. A few admitted to a small compulsion, to go back at night and walk the shore, to see if anything new would be waiting, to test the limits of their courage. Those who returned sometimes found nothing. Sometimes they found more bags. One man told me he found 3 nights running bricks laid in a circle at the edge of the water, half submerged and perfectly aligned. He photographed them and shelved the images because once you start cataloging patterns, you have to be prepared for the possibility that pattern implies agency. Agency is the word that keeps these accounts from becoming mere oddities. The orbs seemed to learn human timing. The threads on the beach answered car beams. The tent at Levitte had been pressed and torn by apparent weight. The bags at Elk Lake were arranged and tidy. What kind of attention is this? Practical? Curious? Malevolent? There is no consensus, only the small, uneasy agreement among witnesses that they were not alone in the sense they had assumed when they stepped onto the trail or set a tent peg. There were follow-ups. A small group of volunteers organized a night watch at Elk Lake with the permission of the county. They set up infrared cameras, thermal scopes, and a few sensitive audio recorders. For 3 nights, nothing dramatic was captured. The temperature was cold, the usual night sounds played out, and the volunteers joked and argued at length about confirmation bias. On the 4th night, the thermal caught 3 small anomalies moving over the water at chest height, each one a fraction cooler than the surrounding air. They were not mechanical heat sources. They registered odd thermal contrasts and then disappeared under the surface of the water, not with a splash, but as if the space would not tolerate their continued presence and closed up behind them. The audio in the tent recorded the low hum, then a thin thread of something like laughter, high and out of place, like a child's wind-up toy. A local radio host played the clip, and the phone lines lit up with callers claiming to have slept poorly for weeks when the hum was loud.
The sheriff's office logged the calls with a polite sense of procedure and a quieter sense of frustration. Stories breed superstition. They breed rituals. A group of kayakers refused to paddle the cove at night. A fisherman who'd camped there every summer for 30 years left town early after the hum started up and took up sea fishing for a season instead. One woman told me she could not let her child sleep in the lakeside bedroom any longer. He would awake at 3 a.m. and say, "They called my name," before falling back to a sleep like someone exhausted. She dismissed the childlike language, called it a dream, but the sliver of worry stayed with her. People change lanes. They choose different campsites. They buy different flashlights. Faced with that change, the lake becomes something like a mirror. It reflects your ordinary life and then returns it with small edits. Your keys set down where you did not leave them, a hum pulsing at the end of the night, a staircase that no longer belongs to any house. There is one report from Elk Lake that ties many of these threads together, and in doing so, turns a cluster of oddities into a proper, lingering dread. A camper, a man who runs a small outfitting business and knows the habits of weather and animal, told of waking at 2 a.m. to a sound like a quiet engine. He assumed another group had moved in. He unzipped his tent and looked out to the black water. There was no boat, no dock light, nothing that could account for the sound. He sat up, and from the far shore came a series of steps. Not human steps, but the impression of steps recorded in the night air, a soft procession like someone respecting the sand. Then from the trees behind him, a voice called his name. It sounded like one of his old employees, a man who used to help load canoes in the spring, and who had left the area 2 years before. The voice called, and then, after a pause, a child's laughter braided with the call. The camper went rigid. He grabbed the flashlight and shone it across the lake. The beam touched the water, and at a distance, a line of 3 small lights reflected back at him, each one perfectly aligned with his beam. When he moved the flashlight, the reflection shifted in lockstep. He tested it 3 times. The lights reacted. At one point, the beam hit the shore and found 3 tied Ziploc bags arranged like a throat at the water's edge. The camper did not go down to get them. He sat in the dark, feeling the hum in his chest, and then at dawn, when the marina opened, he showed his photos to the man at the gas dock. The gas dock man knew the faces of dozens of people who came in and out of the lake. He looked at the photos and said no one he recognized owned the things. Later, the camper told me, someone tried to explain the voice as an old fishing chum's ringtone echoing across phone speakers, but he had no ringtone set for that man.
The voice had that particular cadence that lives in memory, and the man who heard it could tell the difference between a copied cadence and the real thing. This was mimicry executed with intimacy, not a poor facsimile. We have to be careful here. There is no proof the lake is collecting people's things with intent. There is no verified trail of the missing that ends at that cove. But there is a pattern of staged objects, of sounds that behave unlike local engines, of voices borrowing familiarity and returning it at a distance. Those patterns add up to something that affects how people move through these spaces. The thing that gathers personal effects could be a prankster who takes more trouble than any prankster should. It could be a natural phenomenon we do not yet understand. Or it could be something else entirely. The stories do not resolve. They sit in a ledger of hums and lights and arranged plastic bags. There is also aftermath. Survivors, and I mean people who walked away, not those who left as whispers in logs, describe how these events recalibrate their perception. They sleep less well. They look over shoulders in places that once felt safe. They tell younger siblings not to walk that path alone, or they drive a little further to a crowded campground with lanterns and music and bodies about. Some people become fixated. One of the teenagers from Guadalupe kept driving to the bluff at dawn for 3 weeks, scanning for the checkered scorpion, for any hint that would fill the missing hours. He kept a journal with timestamps and small anatomical sketches of the scorpion, as if replicating the curiosity would somehow restore time. He never did find a satisfying answer. He did find a new suspicion that the world could rearrange itself while you blinked. That suspicion is the subtle violence these stories inflict. Nothing physical needs to be proved beyond the bruise on account of his leg, or the tear in a tent, or the timestamp gap on a phone. Those are small, verifiable things. But the larger harm is that a sense of coherence in the world gets chipped. When your environment answers you back in a way you do not control, when a beam of light returns a glance, when a voice uses the sound of your brother to call you out, then the map you used to navigate reality is no longer dependable. At this point, you might expect some tidy resolution. There is none.
These accounts are not puzzles with solutions. They are reports from the edges of known behavior. They are the slow accumulation of quiet, uncanny repetitions that hint at pattern without offering a key. That is more unnerving than any explanation. Mystery is bearable when it is temporary. It becomes corrosive when it insists and returns like tide. So what do people do? They share their stories. They leave notes on local boards. They bring photographs and audio files to rangers, to radio shows, to social media.
A small, careful network forms, an exchange of warnings and tips, of what to watch for and what to ignore. They mark off places in their minds as "don't go there alone" or "bring company." They install brighter lights and keep dogs nearer. They test the edges of what happened by returning with cameras, with friends, with skepticism. Sometimes the return catches nothing. Sometimes the return gets you more footage and another small riddle. I spoke with a park ranger who has been in the region for decades. He has seen the normal strangeness of the wild enough to be patient with odd reports. He told me he logs everything, and that his job is to separate genuine threats to public safety from the theater of human imagination. He said, in patient voice, that people are good at pattern recognition and poor at ignoring anomalies we want to explain. Then he added, almost reluctantly, that there are reports he files and that he can't simply fold into a neat category. Footprints that don't match, gasping gaps in time, objects arranged like offerings. Those things land in a corner of his log labeled indefinito, which is bureaucratese for "we don't have an answer." He checks camera recordings, he coordinates with neighboring jurisdictions, and sometimes he waits. Waiting is what many of these stories do best. People wait at shorelines. They sit up late with thermoses and flashlights. They process their photos and listen to the hum in a loop until it becomes a part of their evening. They wake at odd hours with the sense of being near something that doesn't leave traces like ours do. Perhaps the most common human response to all this is quiet precaution. Lock your car, keep the tent zipped, travel in pairs. These are sensible things. They help with the truck on the road and with the raccoon by the cooler. They do nothing definitive when the world rearranges a day or borrows a voice, but they are the floor of what people have the right to do. If there is one thread that runs through all 7 accounts, it is attention. Attention that mirrors you, attention that borrows your voice, attention that places objects with care, attention that reacts to light and sound. These behaviors could be ecological weirdness, human trickery executed with surprising competence, or something else that defies the categories we use to process events. I do not claim to know which. My role is narrower, to listen and to report faithfully, to carry the testimonies of those who felt watched, and to put them in a line where patterns might be seen. When you bring them together, what emerges is not a narrative of villains and victims, but a portrait of the ordinary interrupted. It is a portrait in which the interruptions are precise, modest, and unnervingly deliberate. So what are we left with? The boy and his scorpion and the blank hours. The counselor with marks like fingers and the impression in an empty mattress. The couple at the beach whose headlights were answered by the sky.
The gold panners afraid of a truck that would not leave them alone. The rooftop camper who woke to his brother's voice and found his tent cut. The dog walker followed by apple-sized lights. The shore at Elk Lake bearing Ziploc offerings and a hum that nests under the ribs. Each episode on its own is disturbing. Together they make a different sound, a constant that keeps rhythm with anxiety. Stories like these do something else too. They shift the way a person moves in the world. You notice the texture of dark in a different way. You carry a tiny flashlight in your pocket even in daytime. You check timestamps on your photos and count the hours between shots. You pay attention to your dog because it knows some things you do not. You stop telling certain parts of the story because words flatten the edges where the dread sits. You keep the small proof, a photograph, a clip, a bruise, as a talisman against being told you imagined it. I will not end with an answer. There is none to offer from where I stand, but I will leave one thought. The wilderness has always been roomy enough to hold the human and the non-human together. It has held storms and foxes and tides. It has also held things that make no sense, and perhaps it always will. These accounts remind us that part of what we call nature is behavior we do not yet recognize, and some of it observes us back. If you have a story like this or something stranger, tell it in the comments or send a message. Share it with someone who camps alone or with a small group. If you like these compilations and want the longer testimonies, the full timestamps, the extra clips, the rawer takes,
There are deeper versions on the patrons feed for folks who want to sit with the details. Subscribe if you want more of this sort of thing. More nights, more accounts, more of the places where people go and come back with questions instead of answers. Tell us what you think in the comments. Did you ever follow a light that answered your hand? Did something call your name in a voice you knew? If you do, be cautious. Go with company, tell someone where you're headed, and do not put yourself in harm's way trying to prove a point. For now, when you step outside tonight and hear a soft buzz under the world, or see a small light glance at you from between the trees, remember the people who walked away puzzled and a little changed. Remember the scorpion that led the sun into missing hours, and the neat bags on a shore that belonged to no one. The woods keep their own timing. Sometimes they answer. Sometimes they place things where no one can explain them. Sometimes they simply watch. Thanks for sitting with these stories. Keep your flashlight handy, and good night.